I never wanted to be an alpha. The words echo in my head like a confession I've whispered 1,000 times, but never loud enough for the world to hear. From the moment I presented as an alpha, it felt as if the entire world had quietly decided what my life should look like, what kind of person I should become, and how I should behave at every moment of every day. Strength, dominance, leadership, and confidence. Those were the words constantly thrown at alphas like commandments carved into stone. And if you failed to live up to them even slightly, people looked at you as if you were some kind of defect. I never asked to be strong. I never asked to lead anyone. I never wanted to dominate anyone. If anything, the more people told me what an alpha was supposed to be, the more I felt like I had been placed inside the wrong body. I still remember the day everything began to feel unbearable. I must have been 16 at the time. Sitting at the dinner table with my parents, while the smell of roasted meat filled the house and the evening news murmured softly from the television in the living room. It should have been an ordinary evening, but something had been pressing against my chest for weeks. A quiet frustration that refused to disappear no matter how much I tried to ignore it. Eventually, the words slipped out before I could stop them. I wish I was born in Omega instead. The moment the sentence left my mouth, the entire room fell silent. My mother froze with her fork halfway to her mouth, her eyes widening slowly as if she had just heard something impossible. My father, who had always been a man of few words, slowly placed his chopsticks down on the table and stared at me in a way that made the back of my neck feel cold. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then my father's voice finally broke the silence. "Don't say something so shameful again." His tone wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that pressed heavily on the room. My mother shook her head in disbelief, looking at me as if I had suddenly become a stranger sitting at their table. "You're an alpha, Sam," she said quietly. "Why would you ever want to be an Omega?" I didn't know how to answer that question properly. I couldn't explain the feeling of constantly pretending to be someone else, or how exhausting it was to keep wearing a mask that everyone expected to see. So instead, I simply lowered my head and said nothing. That was the last time I ever spoke about it in that house. From then on, I learned to keep that part of myself hidden. But even if I never said the words again, the feeling never disappeared. It only grew stronger, which was why getting accepted into university felt like stepping into a completely different world. For the first time in my life, I was far away from home, far away from my parents' expectations, and far away from the suffocating atmosphere that had followed me for years. The campus was enormous, filled with thousands of students who didn't know anything about my past, and that meant I had the rare opportunity to become whoever I wanted to be. And for the first time in my life, I chose to be honest with myself. I stopped forcing my shoulders to stay stiff and straight, like the proper posture alphas were always expected to maintain. I allowed my voice to soften instead of deepening it artificially when I spoke. I wore clothes that I actually liked rather than the rigid masculine outfits my parents used to buy for me. Soft sweaters, loose shirts, light fabrics that felt comfortable rather than intimidating. To my surprise, people immediately assumed I was an Omega. At first, I didn't correct them. Then eventually, I stopped caring enough to explain. And strangely enough, those first few weeks were the happiest I had ever felt. People smiled at me more often. Conversations felt lighter. I could laugh freely without worrying whether I looked dominant enough. For a brief moment, it almost felt like I had finally found a place where I could exist without constantly feeling wrong. But happiness, I eventually learned, can be incredibly short-lived. It only takes one small moment for everything to collapse. For me, that moment arrived in the middle of a crowded classroom. I was sitting quietly near the window during a lecture, when the student beside me suddenly leaned closer, sniffing the air in confusion. His eyebrows slowly knitted together as he looked at me. "You smell like an alpha." I blinked, unsure if I had heard him correctly. "What?" He frowned slightly, sniffing again as if trying to confirm his suspicion. "You're not an Omega, are you?" The question wasn't loud, but the two students sitting in front of us turned around almost immediately. One whisper turned into another, and before I could even process what was happening, the quiet curiosity spread across the room like ripples in water. "He's an alpha, but he looks like an Omega. Why would an alpha act like that?" The whispers didn't stop when the lecture ended. If anything, they grew louder. From that day forward, people began looking at me differently. Some stared openly as if trying to solve a puzzle they didn't understand. Others avoided me completely, especially the other alphas, whose expressions ranged from confusion to subtle disgust whenever our eyes accidentally met. I heard the rumors too. "He's pretending to be an Omega. That's embarrassing. Another one said, "What kind of alpha acts like that?" At first, I tried to pretend it didn't bother me, but loneliness has a way of creeping into your life slowly, almost invisibly. Group discussions became awkward because no one seemed eager to sit beside me. Study groups formed naturally around the classroom. Yet somehow I always ended up alone at my desk while everyone else chatted comfortably with their friends. Lunch breaks were the worst. The cafeteria was always loud with conversation and laughter, but the noise only made the empty seat across from me feel even more obvious. I often found myself staring at my tray for longer than necessary, quietly hoping someone might sit down and start a conversation. Most of the time, no one did. Eventually, I started spending more time in quieter corners of the campus where fewer people would notice me. It wasn't ideal, but at least silence was easier to endure than whispers. Then one afternoon, when I was sitting alone at a table near the dormitory courtyard, someone suddenly dropped their backpack onto the chair across from me with a soft thud. I looked up in surprise. The boy sitting down had messy brown hair and a relaxed smile that seemed completely unaffected by the awkward atmosphere that usually surrounded me. "Hey," he said casually, leaning back in his chair. "You're Sam, right?" I blinked. "Yes." "I'm Jake," he replied, pointing at himself with his thumb. "Your new roommate." For a moment I simply stared at him, unsure how to react. Jake didn't seem uncomfortable at all. In fact, he looked perfectly relaxed, as if sitting with me was the most normal thing in the world. He glanced at the untouched food on my tray and raised an eyebrow. "You've been staring at that rice for like 2 minutes, he said with a small grin. "Are you planning to eat it or just intimidate it until it disappears?" A quiet laugh escaped me before I could stop it. Something about his easygoing tone made the tension in my chest loosen slightly. After a brief pause, he tilted his head and studied me for a moment before speaking again. "So, you're the famous alpha who dresses like an omega?" he asked flatly. The words should have hurt. Instead, Jake simply shrugged. "Honestly," he continued, grabbing a drink from his bag, "I don't really see any problem with that." I looked at him in surprise. "You don't?" He opened the bottle and took a casual sip. "You're not hurting anyone, right? Then who cares?" The simplicity of his answer left me momentarily speechless. For the first time since the rumors started spreading, someone was looking at me without judgment or confusion. Added with a faint smirk. "If you were actually an omega, I'd probably have to worry about a bunch of alphas trying to steal my roommate." I felt my ears grow warm, then I smiled slightly. "You sure know how to use words to make people feel comfortable," I said. Jake laughed. The empty space that had been following me around campus for weeks suddenly felt smaller. And for the first time since everything fell apart, I realized something important. Maybe fitting in wasn't about changing who I was. Maybe it only took one person who simply didn't care about the rules everyone else seemed so obsessed with. And at that moment, sitting across from Jake in the warm afternoon sunlight felt like everything I needed at that moment. I had just finished a long lecture that afternoon and was slowly making my way back toward the dormitories when everything happened. The lecture hall had been unusually stuffy that day, the kind of place where the air felt heavy, and every minute seemed to drag longer than the last. By the time the professor finally dismissed us, most of the students rushed out of the classroom like birds escaping a cage, their voices quickly filling the hallway as conversations and laughter bounced off the walls. I stepped into the corridor a little later than everyone else, adjusting the strap of my bag over my shoulder as I began walking toward the exit that led back to the dorm area. The hallway was crowded, students moving in small clusters, while others leaned against the walls, scrolling through their phones or chatting about assignments. Normally, I would have walked quietly through the crowd without paying much attention to anyone. But that day, something felt different. I noticed the strange shift in the atmosphere that made the noise around me soften slightly, like a ripple moving through water. A few students suddenly stepped aside as if making room for someone, their conversations lowering into hushed whispers. Curious, I slowed my steps. Then I saw them. A group of 5 or 6 guys were walking down the hallway from the opposite direction. Their presence alone enough to make people move out of their path without being asked. They didn't look like the typical students you'd expect to see rushing between lectures. They looked rough. Not in the messy, careless way some students dressed, but in a way that carried a quiet sense of boldness and danger. Their movements were relaxed, confident, as if the entire hallway belonged to them. At first my eyes moved casually over the group, then landed on one of them which stood out from the others. He was walking slightly ahead of the others, tall enough that his presence naturally drew attention without him even trying. His shoulders were broad, his posture straight yet relaxed, and there was something about the calm expression on his face that made him seem completely untouched by the noise around him. His dark hair fell slightly over his forehead, and his sharp eyes looked forward with quiet focus, as if nothing in the hallway was important enough to hold his attention for long. Without realizing it, I had stopped walking. I just stood there in the middle of the corridor watching him approach. The strange thing was, he wasn't doing anything special. He wasn't talking loudly or laughing with his friends. He wasn't trying to intimidate anyone. He simply walked forward with steady steps, his hands resting casually in his pocket. Yet somehow the entire hallway seemed to shift around him. Students moved aside, conversations paused. Even the loudest voices softened as he passed, and for some reason, I couldn't look away. As the group got closer, my heart began beating a little faster, for reasons I couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was simply the overwhelming presence he carried. But something about him made the air feel slightly heavier. For a brief moment, the distance between us was barely a step. Our shoulders nearly brushed as he walked past. I instinctively held my breath. But he didn't look at me. Not even once. His eyes remained forward, completely uninterested in the students around him, as if the hallway was nothing more than an empty space he needed to pass through. And just like that, he walked by. The faint scent of a dangerous pheromone lingered in the air for a moment, before slowly fading, as he continued down the corridor with his group. I turned slightly, watching his back, as he disappeared deeper into the building. Then a sudden voice beside me made me jump. I turned my head and saw Jake standing there, his hands resting on his hips as he followed my line of sight down the hallway. He looked at me with a knowing grin. "You were staring pretty hard." My ears immediately warmed. I quickly looked away, pretending to adjust the sleeve of my sweater. Jake chuckled softly. "Who was he?" Jake glanced down the hallway again, his expression shifting slightly. "That's Adrian." The name felt unfamiliar on my tongue. "Adrian?" "Yeah," Jake said, nodding casually. "Third-year political science department." Jake then lowered his voice slightly, leaning closer as if sharing some kind of secret. "You won't believe this, but I heard he is an enigma. The type no one dares to mess with." I looked at Jake in surprise. I've always heard about enigmas, but it was my first time seeing one in person. Then Jake continued. "His parents are freaking rich and professors love him." Something about the way Jake said, it made me feel a small chill crawl up my spine. I glanced down the hallway again, though Adrian was already long gone. For some reason, the image of him walking calmly through the crowd replayed in my mind, the quiet confidence, the way people instinctively moved out of his path, and the strange feeling that had settled in my chest when he passed by me without even noticing I was there. I continued walking toward the dorm building beside Jake, trying to push the strange encounter out of my thoughts. After the day I first saw Adrian in the hallway, something strange began happening to me. I started noticing him everywhere. Not because he was constantly around me, but because once you had seen him once, it suddenly became impossible not to recognize him in a crowd. His presence was the kind that quietly stood out even when he wasn't trying to draw attention, like a shadow that naturally made the surrounding light seem dimmer. Sometimes I would catch a glimpse of him across the campus courtyard, walking with the same group of guys I had seen that day in the hallway. Other times I would notice him leaving one of the larger lecture buildings, his calm expression unchanged as students instinctively moved out of his way without even realizing they were doing it. Each time it happened, my eyes seemed to find him before my brain had the chance to stop them. It was a strange habit that formed without my permission. And before long, I realized something that made my ears heat up every time the thought crossed my mind. I had developed a crush on him. It sounded ridiculous even inside my own head. Adrian probably didn't even know I existed. The only moment we had ever shared was that brief second in the hallway when our shoulders almost brushed. And even then he hadn't bothered to glance in my direction. Yet somehow that hadn't stopped my attention from drifting toward him whenever he appeared nearby. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing more than curiosity. But deep down, I knew that wasn't entirely true. One evening, the university held a student hangout event. Apparently, it was meant to help different departments socialize with each other outside of lectures, though most students treated it as an excuse to drink, play loud music, and forget about their assignments for a few hours. Jake had insisted we go. "You've been hiding in the dorm too much lately," he said while dragging me out of our room. "If you don't start interacting with actual human beings soon, You're going to turn into a ghost," he said jokingly. Eventually, I gave up arguing. By the time we arrived at the event hall, the place was already buzzing with energy. Music echoed through the large space, while groups of students gathered around tables filled with drinks and snacks, their laughter blending together into a lively atmosphere that felt almost overwhelming. Jake disappeared almost immediately after we entered, claiming he had spotted someone from his department. I was left standing, awkwardly adjusting the sleeves of the cropped-out fit I had chosen earlier that evening. The top exposed a small portion of my waist, something that would have made my parents faint if they ever saw it. After a few minutes, I decided to grab a drink. The refreshment table stood near the center of the hall, surrounded by several other students who were chatting casually while reaching for cups and bottles. I stepped closer and reached out toward a bottle of soda. At the exact same moment, another hand reached for the same drink. Our fingers brushed lightly. Startled, I looked up and immediately felt my heart skip. It was Adrian. For a brief moment, neither of us moved. My hand instinctively pulled away first. "Sorry," I said quickly. Adrian didn't respond right away. Instead, his eyes lingered on me. It wasn't an aggressive stare, but it felt assessing, like he was silently examining something he hadn't expected to see. The intensity of his gaze made my face grow warm. Was he judging me? The thought made my shoulders stiffen slightly. Then one of his friends suddenly walked over and clapped him on the shoulder, saying something I couldn't quite hear over the music. Adrian's attention shifted away from me just as quietly as it had appeared. Without another word, he picked up the drink and walked away with his group. I exhaled slowly, only then realizing I had been holding my breath. "That was awkward," I muttered under my breath, grabbing a different drink this time. I quickly moved away from the table and searched for Jake in the crowd. I eventually found him near the far side of the hall, talking to a girl with who looked like she belonged to the Omega class. Jake waved me over. I walked over, still slightly distracted by what had just happened. "This is Lily," Jake said, gesturing toward the girl. She smiled warmly. "You're Sam? Jake told me about you." I blinked in confusion. "He did?" "Of course," she said with a small laugh. "You're cute." My ears instantly turned red. Before I could respond, a sudden commotion erupted across the room. Several students had turned toward a nearby table. Curious, I followed their gaze. Adrian was sitting there with his usual group, looking as calm as ever. An Omega girl stood beside him, leaning close while speaking animatedly, her expression bright with obvious interest. Even from across the room, it was clear she was flirting. But Adrian's reaction was cold. He said something quietly. The girl's smile slowly faded. A moment later, she covered her face and rushed away, clearly embarrassed. The table fell silent. Then Adrian simply picked up his drink as if nothing had happened. Lily sighed softly. "Poor thing. She probably thought she had a chance," Lily said. "Is he always like that?" I asked. Lily leaned closer. "Adrian doesn't like Omegas. Apparently, he thinks Omegas are too feminine." I blinked in surprise. "Then what is he like?" Lily smiled faintly. Masculine alphas, the word settled heavily in my chest. For a moment, I simply stared down at the drink in my hands. That means my chances were already zero. As the music continued playing and the crowd laughed around us, I couldn't stop myself from glancing across the room again. Adrian was still sitting there, calm, unbothered, completely out of reach. And suddenly, the small crush I'd been quietly carrying around felt even more ridiculous than before. Because even though I was technically an alpha, anyone who looked at me would only see something else entirely. Later that night, we were standing outside a large building near the edge of campus, where music was already through the walls. The line of students waiting to enter stretched along the walkway. Jake handed 2 tickets to the person checking the entrance. They barely glanced at me before waving us inside. Just like that, we had successfully sneaked into a senior-only event. The inside of the club was dimly lit, colorful lights flashing across the room, while music vibrated through the floor beneath our feet. Students crowded around tables and the dance floor, laughter mixing with the loud rhythm of the speakers. Jake disappeared almost immediately. "I'm going to find Lily," he shouted over the music. Then he was gone. I stood there for a moment, slightly overwhelmed by the noise and movement around me. Eventually, I grabbed a drink and moved toward the far end of the room, where quieter seating area stretched along the wall. It was far enough from the dance floor that the music felt slightly less intense, though the bass still hummed faintly in the background. I sat down alone, and that's when I saw him, Adrian. He was sitting several tables away, surrounded by his loud friends. Even in the dim club lighting, it was impossible not to recognize him immediately. He looked perfect. There was no other word for it. The faint glow of the colored lights reflected across his sharp features while he leaned back in his chair, listening calmly to something one of his friends was saying. Every now and then he spoke quietly, his expression composed in that same calm, unreadable way that seemed to follow him everywhere. Without realizing it, I had been staring again. I quickly looked down at my drink. "This is ridiculous," I muttered softly. To distract myself, I took a long sip, then another. The drink was stronger than I expected. Or maybe I simply drank too quickly. Either way, the warmth spread through my chest faster than I intended, making the music seem louder and the lights slightly blurrier as time passed. At some point, I decided I needed fresh air, or maybe the restroom. That sounded like a good idea. I stood up carefully and walked toward the hallway, near the back of the club where the restrooms were located. My steps slightly slower than usual, as the alcohol made the floor feel less stable than before. The hallway was much quieter. When I pushed open the restroom door, the cool air inside immediately helped clear my head a little. And that's when I realized someone else was there already, standing in front of the sink. It was Adrian. He had just finished washing his hands, water dripping quietly into the basin as he reached for a paper towel. For a moment, he didn't seem to notice me standing near the entrance. Then he glanced up at the mirror. Our eyes met through the reflection. The silence between us felt strangely heavy. For some reason, the alcohol in my system suddenly made my thoughts much louder than usual. Before my brain could stop me, I spoke. "Why do you always look like that?" Adrian turned slightly, his brows knitting together in faint confusion. "Like what?" I took a few unsteady steps closer. "Like you're untouchable." He didn't respond. I let out a small laugh. "You always walk around like nothing in the world bothers you." My chest felt strangely tight. "And you always ignore me." That part slipped out more quietly than I intended. Adrian's gaze sharpened slightly. "Do you hate me or something?" The question lingered in the air between us. But Adrian didn't answer. He simply watched me. That silence made something inside my chest twist. The alcohol swirling in my head suddenly made the moment feel heavier. The frustration that had quietly built up over the past few weeks, spilling out before I could stop it. "Say something," I murmured. But Adrian remained still. For some reason, that made me even more upset. Before I could think properly, my hand reached forward and grabbed the front of Adrian's shirt. He looked slightly surprised, and then I kissed him. It happened so quickly that even my own brain didn't seem to understand what I had just done. My lips pressed against his for only a few seconds, but those seconds felt endless. Then suddenly, reality crashed back into my mind. My eyes widened. I immediately pulled away. My heart was pounding violently in my chest. "I'm sorry." Adrian hadn't moved. He was still standing there, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. But I didn't stay long enough to figure it out. Panic rushed through my body all at once. Without another word, I turned and rushed out of the restroom, my face burning with embarrassment as I pushed through the club crowd and headed straight for the exit. I didn't stop running until I reached the dorm building. By the time I finally collapsed onto my bed, my entire body felt like it was on fire. What did I just do? I groaned into my pillow. My mind replayed the moment over and over again, the questions I had asked him, the way I had grabbed his shirt, the kiss. I buried my face deeper into the pillow. Out of all the reckless, embarrassing things I could have possibly done in that moment, I had somehow managed to do the worst one. I had kissed Adrian, and now, I had absolutely no idea what would happen next. The next morning, I woke up wishing the previous night had never happened. For a few seconds after opening my eyes, everything felt normal. The sunlight was slipping through the dorm window, the room was quiet, and the faint hum of the campus morning drifted in from outside. I slowly pulled the pillow over my face, as if hiding from the sunlight might somehow erase what I had done the previous night. But it didn't. Every single detail came rushing back with painful clarity. And worst of all, the moment my lips had actually touched his. I groaned quietly. What was I thinking? Alcohol had apparently turned off the part of my brain responsible for self-preservation. I rolled over on the bed, staring at the ceiling with a deep sense of dread settling in my chest. Adrian probably hates me now. That wasn't even the worst possibility. He probably thought I was insane. A junior student sneaking into a senior event, confronting him in a restroom, asking strange questions, and then suddenly kissing him without permission. The more I thought about it, the worse it sounded. I pressed both hands against my face. What if Adrian told people? What if the story spread across campus? What if every student suddenly knew I had drunkenly kissed him in a restroom? The humiliation alone would probably kill me. But strangely enough, the day passed quietly. No whispers, no rumors, no strange looks from other students. It was almost as if nothing had happened. By the second day, I started convincing myself that maybe Adrian had simply forgotten about it. For some reason, it left a strange emptiness in my chest. For nearly a full week, I hadn't seen Adrian anywhere on campus. Not in the courtyard, not near the lecture halls, not even in the library. Eventually, I convinced myself that the problem had solved itself. Adrian probably had no interest in thinking about me again. And honestly, that was probably for the best. Until one afternoon, when I was leaving a lecture and walking across the quiet campus hallway toward the dorms. Students passed by in small groups while chatting about their classes. Everything felt completely normal. Then suddenly, a hand grabbed my wrist. My entire body froze. The grip was firm. My heart skipped violently as I turned around and saw Adrian standing right behind me. His expression was calm as always, but this time his eyes were focused entirely on me. The moment Adrian grabbed my wrist in the hallway, my entire body froze. Students were still walking past us in both directions, their footsteps echoing faintly across the tiled floor as conversations blended into the background noise of the busy corridor. Yet none of those sounds seemed to reach me, because all I could feel was the firm warmth of Adrian's hand wrapped around my wrist, holding me in place as if he had decided that running away was no longer an option I was allowed to choose. My heart immediately began beating faster. Slowly, I forced myself to glance up. Adrian was standing very close. His tall frame cast a shadow over me, and as always, his expression remained calm and unreadable, the same composed look that made most students keep their distance from him, without even trying to understand why. For a moment, he didn't say anything, he simply looked at me. Not the casual glance people usually give before looking away, but the same focused gaze he had used before. The kind that made it feel like he was quietly studying every reaction on my face. I shifted awkwardly under that attention, my fingers tightening around the strap of my bag, while I tried to think of something that would allow me to escape the situation without completely embarrassing myself. But Adrian spoke first. "Why have you been avoiding me?" he asked. His voice was low and steady, almost quiet. The question made my chest tighten instantly. I tried to brush it off, pretending that I simply had somewhere to go. Yet even as the words left my mouth, I knew how weak they sounded, because Adrian continued watching me with that same quiet patience, as if he could easily see through the excuse without needing to challenge it directly. And that somehow made me even more nervous. "I'm sorry for what happened. It was a mistake," I said. The moment those words left my mouth, Adrian's gaze changed slightly, not in anger or annoyance, but in a way that made it feel like he was reconsidering something quietly in his mind. For a brief second, his hand loosened around my wrist, and I thought he was finally going to let me go. Instead, his fingers moved upward. Before I could react, he gently placed his hand at the back of my neck. The sudden contact made my breath catch. Now I had no choice but to look directly at him. Up close, Adrian's expression was even harder to read. Yet his eyes held a quiet intensity that made my heart race uncontrollably, because he wasn't looking at me the way people usually did, with confusion or judgment about the way I behaved as an alpha. He was simply observing me, and somehow that felt far more intimidating. "It was a mistake." He repeated my words softly. "Yes, and I swear I was drunk and didn't know what I was thinking." Adrian didn't argue with me. He simply watched my face for another long moment, as if measuring the sincerity of my answer. Then unexpectedly, a faint smile appeared on his lips. It was subtle and brief, yet seeing that expression from someone as composed as Adrian felt strangely disarming. "You talk pretty much when you are drunk," he said, a small grin tugging his face. I tried to deny it immediately, but the embarrassment already burning across my face made the argument completely useless. Adrian stepped back slightly after that, finally giving me a little space to breathe again, though his eyes remained focused on me, as if the conversation was still unfinished. "You are quite interesting," he said, still staring directly at me. The words caught me completely off guard. The hallway suddenly felt quieter again after that. Students continued walking around us. Yet the space between Adrian and me felt strangely separate from the rest of the world, like a small pause in the middle of an otherwise ordinary day. Eventually, Adrian stepped away completely. Without another word, he turned and began walking down the hallway, his calm presence disappearing slowly into the crowd of students. I remained standing there long after he left. My mind replayed the conversation over and over again. I used to think the worst thing that could happen to me on campus was being invisible. But that afternoon, I realized something worse existed. The lecture had ended almost 20 minutes earlier. Yet I still lingered near the academic building, slowly organizing my books as I walked. The sun was already dipping lower in the sky, casting long orange shadows across the campus walkway, and most students had already dispersed toward their dorms or the cafeteria. I preferred walking alone anyway. Less attention, less whispers. Unfortunately, that day didn't go the way I had hoped. Just as I turned a corner near the engineering building where Jake was attending lectures, 3 guys stepped directly into my path. They weren't strangers. I had seen them around campus before. Loud, arrogant Year 2 seniors, who seemed to treat the university like their personal playground. One of them looked down at the books in my arms and chuckled. "Well, look who it is," he said. "The quiet little alpha who pretends to be an Omega." He nudged his friend. "Yeah, the one who never talks." I tightened my grip on my books and tried to walk past them. "I'm in a hurry," I muttered. But one of them stepped sideways, blocking me again. "Relax," he said casually. "We just want to talk." My stomach tightened. Conversations like this never ended well. Another one leaned closer, his voice mocking. "You're in the same faculty as Adrian, right?" The moment I heard that name, my chest stiffened. Adrian, even hearing his name, felt dangerous. "What about it?" I asked quietly. The guy smirked. "You follow him around like a lost puppy," he said. "Are you trying to get his attention or something?" The other one laughed loudly and said, "He doesn't even have a chance. Adrian hates his type." My fingers trembled slightly around my books. I hated that sentence. I had heard it so many times before. "Leave me alone," I said under my breath. But one of them suddenly pushed my shoulder. My books slipped from my arms and scattered across the ground. The sound echoed loudly in the quiet walkway. They laughed. "Oops," one of them said mockingly. I crouched down quickly, trying to gather the books before anyone else noticed. But then a shadow fell across the ground. The laughter stopped. A calm voice spoke behind them. "That's enough." I froze. My heart skipped for a second. I knew that voice. The 3 guys slowly turned around. Standing a few steps behind them was Adrian. His expression was calm, but his eyes were sharp in a way that made the air around us feel suddenly heavier. One of the guys scratched his neck awkwardly. "We were just joking," he said. Adrian didn't respond immediately. He simply looked at the books scattered on the ground, then at me kneeling there. Something cold flickered across his gaze. Then he spoke again. "Pick them up." The 3 boys blinked. Adrian's voice remained steady. "You pushed him, so pick up his stuff." For a moment, none of them moved. Then one of the guys quickly bent down and started gathering the books. The other 2 followed. Within seconds, all my books were stacked neatly and placed back into my arms. "Sorry," one of them muttered quickly before the 3 of them hurried away without another word. The walkway fell silent again. My heart was beating so loudly I could barely think. Slowly, I stood up. Adrian was still there watching me. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he sighed softly. "Come with me." My brain barely processed the words, but my feet moved anyway. He walked ahead calmly, leading me away from the main walkway toward a quieter part of campus near the old garden behind the library. The place was almost empty. Only the sound of leaves moving gently in the wind filled the air. Adrian stopped beneath a tall tree and finally turned to face me. For a moment, he simply studied my face. That intense gaze again made my chest feel tight. "Thank you for earlier," I said awkwardly. He didn't reply. Instead, he took a small step closer. My heart immediately began racing. Then suddenly, Adrian reached out. His hand gently lifted my chin. My breath caught in my throat. His fingers were warm as they lightly cupped my face, tilting it upward so I had no choice but to meet his eyes. Up close, his gaze was even more intense. "You are the first person who has ever caught my attention in this campus," he said. My brain completely stopped working. Before I could respond, his hand slid down from my cheek and gently took my hand. His fingers intertwined with mine naturally, as if it had always belonged there. I stared down in shock. Adrian looked at our joined hands thoughtfully. "You have nice hands," he murmured. My face grew even hotter. "They're just normal," I said flatly. He shook his head slightly. "Long fingers," he said, his thumb lightly brushing against mine. "They're beautiful." My heart felt like it was about to explode. Then he looked at me again, and for the first time since I met him, his expression softened. "I want to get to know you more," he said quietly. "Your personality draws me in." My breath hitched. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I didn't know what exactly to tell him, because I was having a mixed feeling of happiness and nervousness. Because the calm, untouchable Adrian everyone feared was standing in front of me and holding my hand, looking at me with sharp, devouring eyes. A simple but ridiculous thought hit me. Is Adrian flirting with me? After that afternoon in the garden, Adrian started showing up in my face more frequently. It was as if the tables turned from me chasing him to him chasing me. He was still the same calm, intellectual enigma everyone knew. The only difference was the way he treated me. He started walking me back to my dorm after lectures. At first, we barely spoke during those walks. Adrian wasn't the type to fill silence with meaningless words, and strangely, I found myself growing comfortable with that quiet space between us. Sometimes he would simply glance at me, his sharp eyes studying my face like he was trying to memorize every detail. Other times, he would suddenly reach for my hand while we walked, holding it naturally, like it was the most normal thing in the world. The first time he did that in public, my entire face turned red. Adrian only smiled faintly. "You blush easily," he said. I covered my face with my sleeve. "Stop looking at me like that." "Like what?" "Like you're analyzing me." His fingers tightened slightly around mine. "I am," he said calmly, and somehow that made my heart race even faster. Soon, spending time with Adrian became the best part of my day. We studied together in the library. We walked around campus late in the evening when most students had already returned to their dorms. And sometimes, Adrian would drag me out of campus entirely. Jake noticed the sudden closeness between us. His only advice for me was to report to him if Adrian ever hurt my feelings. I chuckled slightly and told him not to worry too much. One evening, Adrian suddenly appeared outside my dorm and said, "Get ready, we're going out." That was how we ended up at a small cinema near campus. I remember sitting beside him in the dim theater, trying to focus on the movie while being painfully aware of his dominant enigma presence next to me. Halfway through the film, I felt his pheromones hovering around me. His hand slowly slid over mine. My heart jumped. I glanced sideways. Adrian wasn't even looking at me. His eyes were still fixed on the screen as he intertwined our fingers together, but the small smile at the corner of his lips gave him away. When the movie ended and we stepped outside, the cool night air brushed against my face. I turned to say something, but Adrian suddenly pulled me closer. Before I could react, his hand gently cupped my cheek. Then he leaned down and kissed me. The world seemed to pause. It was slow, warm, and incredibly gentle. When he pulled away, I was completely speechless. Adrian brushed his thumb lightly against my cheek. "You think too much?" he said jokingly. "I do not." He smiled, then he leaned closer again, resting his forehead against mine. "But I like that about you." Soon after that, the semester finally ended. Students began leaving campus for the school break, and for the first time in months, I returned home. Being back in my childhood house felt strange. Everything looked the same, yet I felt different. One afternoon, I was sitting on the couch texting Adrian. He had already sent me 3 messages complaining that he felt bored without me. "It's only been 2 days," I said, smiling at the screen. Just then, my mother walked into the living room. She glanced at me curiously. "You've been smiling at your phones all day," she said. I froze. My mom sat beside me and gently nudged my shoulder. "Who are you talking to?" I hesitated. But before I could hide the screen, Adrian suddenly sent another message. My mother leaned slightly closer, and she saw his name. "Who is he?" she asked almost immediately. There was a short silence. "He's my friend, Mom." She looked at me closely as if trying to read my face. Then she asked softly, "Sam, do you love him?" My heart tightened. I slowly nodded. "Yes." She looked at the screen again. "Does he love you too?" I didn't even hesitate. "He does," I said quietly. My mother stared at me for a moment. Then she smiled. She reached over and gently held my hand. "Sam," she said gently, "your father and I may not understand everything immediately, but you are still our son." My chest tightened. "You don't have to change yourself to make us happy," she continued. "We are already proud of you." My vision blurred slightly. I smiled and embraced her in a warm hug. For the first time in years, I felt a relief. A few days later, Adrian came to visit. When I opened the door and saw him standing there holding a small travel bag, I nearly dropped my phone in excitement. He looked completely calm. Then he added casually, "I missed you." My face immediately turned red. I introduced him to my parents, who felt happy seeing me bring a friend to our home for the first time. Later that evening, we sat together in the quiet backyard of my house. The sky was painted with soft evening colors. Adrian sat beside me, his fingers gently intertwined with mine. I looked down at our hands and smiled softly. For so many years, I had been afraid of being myself, afraid of being judged, and afraid of not fitting the role people expected from an alpha. But now, sitting here with Adrian beside me and knowing my parents still loved me, I finally understood something important. I turned slightly toward him and spoke quietly. "I'm glad I didn't change who I was." Adrian glanced at me. "What do you mean?" I smiled. "I thought I had to become someone else to be loved and accepted, but I didn't. I just had to accept myself first." Adrian's fingers squeezed mine gently. You are unique the way you are, he said. You don't have to go against yourself just to please people to feel accepted. He was right. I didn't need to change my appearance or hide my personality. I didn't need to become the perfect alpha everyone expected. All I needed was the courage to be myself. And somehow, that was enough to find love. From that moment on, we started dating. The weeks that followed were the happiest I had ever experienced. Adrian became much more affectionate when we were alone. He liked playing with my fingers while we talked. He liked brushing my hair away from my face. And sometimes, when he thought I wasn't paying attention, he would stare at me with an intensity that made my heart skip and kiss me on my cheeks. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, comment, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching. See you next time.